Hello everyone. It's another wonderful April day here in Taree on the mid-north coast of New South Wales in Australia. And I'm here with Dr. Peter Oldmeadow, who I was fortunate to speak to yesterday about Buddhism and Western philosophy. Besides being very knowledgeable about Buddhism and Western ways of thinking, Peter is also a Sanskrit scholar. And he's agreed to share some information about Sanskrit for the benefit of Dharma practitioners, perhaps those who are doing Shedra in the West, and anyone interested in learning more about Sanskrit in general. Thanks again for your time, Peter.
Pleasure.
So how did you first become interested in Sanskrit?
Well, I was doing an arts degree at Sydney University, and my particular interest was in Buddhism, and I was writing a lot of essays on Buddhism, and I was including the diacritical marks to indicate the Sanskrit letters. So that's things like a line across the top of an A changes a short A to a long A, so instead of A, pronounced R, and ones on S's that make an S go to a sh sound and things like that. And the opportunity came up to do a course, especially for people who wanted to do honours work. That's an extra year, and a thesis on something related to India. So I enrolled as an extra subject in this subject called Indian Studies, and half of the unit was Sanskrit, important to a lot of areas of Indian cultural and religious life. So my motivation was really to learn about these diacritic marks so that I would know what they actually meant. So I enrolled in this course and discovered what a beautiful language was, Sanskrit was, and fell in love with the language and took it from there. So I ended up going to ANU and doing another degree in Sanskrit, and then eventually a PhD, which was in Sanskrit and Buddhist philosophy. So a very small interest ended up in a lifetime passion.
And how does Sanskrit differ from, say, English or one of the Romantic languages like French, Italian, Spanish, and so on?
Well, yes, Sanskrit's actually related because all of these languages are called Indo-European languages. And in fact, it wasn't until the Europeans discovered Sanskrit language that they realised that these languages were all related to each other. Because of the surviving languages, the oldest, or the one that's closest to some common language, out of which all the European and North Indian languages came, and many other languages as well, the closest survivor is Sanskrit. And so when people started looking at Sanskrit in India, they suddenly saw that there were a lot of words that were similar, and in particular they noticed not so much similarities to English and French, but to ancient Greek and Latin. So in terms of how it's different to modern languages, Sanskrit's much more like classical Greek or Latin, that it's a heavily inflected language. That's to say that the function of the words is indicated by changes to the end of the word. So in English we indicate like the function of a noun in a sentence often by a preposition, like on the table or by the hand. Those things are actually indicated by a different form of the noun. So you change the end of the word. So one to indicate possession, one to indicate it's the subject of a sentence, one to indicate it's a location, and so forth. And that structure of the language is pretty similar between ancient Greek and Sanskrit. And also the verb system of Sanskrit and ancient Greek, and to a degree of Latin. So in my own experience of teaching Sanskrit, I've found it's highly advantageous if students have done classical Greek or Latin. Like people who have mastered classical Greek find Sanskrit quite straightforward. So yes, so there is this relationship. In fact, I might just add as a point of interest that the whole study of linguistics in the West as a discipline actually came out of the study of Sanskrit, because the ancient grammarians were great, Sanskrit grammarians were great studiers of the grammar of the language, but they were also great studiers of phonology, sound, and various things about linguistics. So they're very systematic, you might almost say scientific study of the language. And a lot of the terminology we use in Western linguistics actually comes from the Sanskrit tradition.
Right. I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Can you say something about the roots of Sanskrit language and how the words are built upon these roots? When we were speaking the other day, you mentioned the word samadhi, and many Buddhist practitioners will be familiar with that word, but if you could just, as an example, show how you can break that down.
Yeah. Well, one of the things the ancient grammarians did was they carried out a very thorough study of the language, and they came to the conclusion that the language was built up from verbal roots. And they analysed the structure of the language into about 2,000 root words, or roots, dhatu, building blocks, you might say. They're not necessarily words, they're just a form on which words are created. And if you know the verbal form, then you can, and some other information, but how it belongs to different classes, but then you can build verb forms and noun forms, action nouns, and so on. So, yes, so understanding that if you're learning Sanskrit or getting some insight into Sanskrit, you can learn a lot by learning the root word that lies behind any particular word. So when I'm learning Sanskrit, whatever the word or verb form it was, I'd also learn the root word, and that would give me an insight into other words that were related. And the other thing that they use a lot in verbs, but also in nouns, nominal forms, is prefixes. And prefixes often modify the meaning of the word. So, for example, the prefix "a," a long A, makes something come towards you or into you or direction towards you. Or the prefix "some" has the idea of completion or integration. So just to give a couple of examples that you might be aware of. Gata means gone, but agata means come. So the "a" has changed the meaning of the word, modified it. So if we take the example of samadhi, which we might translate into English as concentration, if we look at the Sanskrit of it, the root from which di, so we've got three components of that word. We've got di, which is the verbal component. We've got a, which is a prefix, and we've got some, that's another prefix. So the root from which di comes means to place. So there's this idea of placing. And then a has the idea of bringing it into you or towards you, and some has the idea of integration. So the idea of samadhi is, if you like, you're collecting yourself into yourself and then integrating that into yourself. So then we can see how the idea of concentration or mental integration comes into the word samadhi. And I think I mentioned to you yesterday, Matt, that a scholar of India called Maciej Eliade was thinking, well, it's hard to translate this word. And so he came up for a new translation which he called ecstasy, which was the opposite of ecstasy. Ecstasy is to stand outside yourself. So he wanted to get this idea of, stability, whereas X is outside, N inside. So he came up with this word ecstasy, to actually be inside yourself instead of outside yourself. So that's an example. I could give one other example that I think I mentioned yesterday.
Yes, please.
And there's the word bhavana, which is also another word that's commonly translated meditation, quite inadequately, but is more oftenly translated as cultivation or meditative cultivation. Tibetan word gom. And in Tibetan it has the idea of becoming familiar with or habituation. But if we look at the Sanskrit of it, it actually comes from the Sanskrit verb to be, verbal root to be, bhu, to be, and it's a form called a causative. So bhavana, which is a nominal form, is causing something to be. So it's like in meditation, first of all you listen to something, then you contemplate something, and then you actually make it real, you cause it to be. So bhavana is causing it to be. So you can see that if you understand that word and where it comes from, you get a stronger sense of what it means than if you just say it means cultivation or meditation. But you can't really come up with an English expression causing it to be. Well, you could, but it would be regarded as clunky and nobody would use it. But if you understand the Sanskrit and you say bhavana, often when I see, if I'm reading the word meditation, I think, well, what word are they thinking of? Meditation covers about 20 words in Sanskrit.
Yeah. That's a much richer interpretation of the word once you understand the Sanskrit. And following on from that, what are some of the benefits of learning Sanskrit for Dharma practitioners? That can be one benefit.
That's a very important one, I think.
Yes.
Well, as I was saying to you yesterday, Matt, I think insofar as there's going to be an international kind of language of Dharma terminology, I think Sanskrit will be the language. Firstly, because the Mahayana traditions of Tibet, China, whatever, come from the Sanskrit tradition. So if a Chinese one in the Chinese tradition wants to communicate to somebody in the Tibetan tradition, the logical way for them to communicate is via the Sanskrit word. So that's one good reason. And certain words, I think we should take the usage of the Sanskrit word. Some of them are already there, like nirvana and Buddha, karma. These are all Sanskrit words, and they're part of the ordinary language. You'll find them in the dictionary. But for Dharma practitioners, there's a lot more words that they should become familiar with, I think. Like, words like Dharmakaya and Sambhogakaya, these kind of words that are difficult to translate adequately and be up to date. There's no agreed translation to these words anyway. So if people could become familiar with the word, and I often read something, I'll say, what's that? And then I'll say, oh, that's Dharmakaya. And then I know what it means because I understand that word. It might be said, well, Pali is another important language for Buddhism. So the canonical languages in which Buddhist texts were preserved in India were either in Pali language or Sanskrit language. But Pali and Sanskrit are actually very close together, so that if you understand the Sanskrit word, you will recognize the Pali word as well. So Pali is closer to a spoken form of the language. And so just to give you an example, so in Sanskrit, nirvana becomes nibbana. And what's happened there, in Pali, you don't get two consonants conjoined, like you've got R and V, nirvana. So they simplify that to nibbana. And also it's common in kind of spoken forms to actually transfer a wah or ba sound to a ba, easier to say, so we get nibbana. So, but you can easily recognize that nibbana is the same as nirvana. Same you have in Pali, dhamma, because you don't have the conjunct dharma, so you get dhamma, or kamma for karma. So if you understand the Sanskrit, you can easily understand the Pali word as well. And likewise, the person who understands Pali, if you use Sanskrit terminology, they will understand. In fact, some words have passed into English probably from Pali, like vipassana, for example. So the Sanskrit is actually vipashyana, but in Pali you don't have the conjunct sya, you just have double S. So because vipassana meditation was kind of marketed, shall we say, by the Theravada tradition, people know the word vipassana. So even in Tibetan you often hear people say vipassana. So they're very good reasons, I think, for gaining some familiarity. And the other thing, and maybe a minor thing, is it'll help you to pronounce properly not only these words, but Sanskrit mantras and so forth. So, and it's quite common these days for Tibetan teachers to encourage people to use the Sanskrit pronunciation. It's often fine to use either the form in which you receive the word, like Benza, for example, but the Sanskrit's actually Vajra. So some teachers will say, well, it'd be very good if you learn the Sanskrit pronunciation. So I think, for example, Dzongsa Khyentse is very keen for people to use correct Sanskrit pronunciation of mantras and names and terms coming from Sanskrit. So you can very easily learn how to pronounce Sanskrit words, and just, even common ones that are commonly mispronounced, like shunyata instead of shunyata. Yeah. And I don't know how many times I've heard dharmata or dharmata, where it should be dharmata. And if you understand the way, just by understanding the long sound, like shunyata, it's got a long A on the end, and that's where shunyata, dharmata, not dhamata. And so you can very quickly, with very little effort, learn a much better pronunciation.
Absolutely. And might you want to comment on how Sanskrit differs from English, because English is grabbing all these words from different cultures and...
That's right. Well, I mean, as I said to you, Matt, all languages are wonderful, so I don't believe in denigrating languages or saying one language is inferior.
Yeah.
But however, English is drawn from many different sources. Like we've got a large number of French words, but we've also got words that come from the Germanic languages, words that came from the Vikings, words that come from Old Anglo-Saxon. We've got words from Greek that are used in, technical language and so forth. So we have a real potpourri of words in English. The difference with Sanskrit is they all come from the same source. So, and they can all be related to these verbal roots, which makes the language very kind of transparent. Once you get some understanding of the language, you can see the bones of the language behind the word. And one of the beauties of that is, particularly from a philosophical and dharmic point of view, is you can see the resonances of the word, shall we say. Once you see, what a word is or what its root is, you see how it relates to other words and so forth. So it gives you a much richer kind of thing. And that was one of the things that I really liked about learning Sanskrit, that I could see how these philosophical ideas and so forth actually related, back to fundamental words, and also understand why apparently completely different meanings. Like, just to give you an example, the word dharma. Dharma can mean a lot of different things.
Yes.
Dharma can mean like the dharmas, the fundamental building blocks of Abhidharma. Or it can mean the religious or the spiritual teaching of the Buddha. It can mean in Hinduism your duty to caste, and many, many other meanings. And pressed in India, it's often, since there's no word for religion, people will say, what is your dharma? So what they're asking you is, are you a Christian or are you a Buddhist? So these all come from the root dharma. You think, well, how can it be this and that and that? And then once you understand that the root meaning, or the root of dharma, is dri, which is something that supports or holds, and then you can see how dharma could then mean like the law. It's like the law that holds everything together. It could also be your duty, because it shows how you fit into the scheme of things. And when the Buddha taught the Dharma, he was teaching the way things are. He wasn't, it's not really the teaching. What did the Buddha teach? He taught the way things are, Dharma, how everything works, how it's all held together. So if you understand that, you then see that Dharma can become teaching, can become law, can become duty, can become a whole range of things. I think even in Buddhism there's something like 8 different meanings of Dharma. But if you understand the verbal root gari, you can see they all resonate from that one meaning. And a skillful writer in any language, when they use particular language and words, they are using part of that resonance.
Yes.
But if you translate a word into English, the word in English, like faith, for example, it has a complete different range of resonances.
Yes.
People say, hang on, they're telling us we've got to have faith. Do they want us to subscribe to some dogma?
Yes.
That's because faith in English is often associated with all of these other connotations. Whereas the word in Sanskrit has more connotations like confidence, interest. So it has a whole other range of meanings. But when you translate it, you can't translate you should have confidence, interest, and 3 other things. So you think, what am I going to do? And so you think, will I put faith or will I put confidence? But if you know what the word is, then it means all of those things.
Yeah. It's just occurred to me that studying Sanskrit might be one way of sidestepping a little bit of the cultural baggage that we have in the Western context. I mean, you can't totally extricate yourself from your social conditioning, but it's just occurred to me that it could, in some ways, get at the heart or the key aspect of the meaning.
Yeah, because learning another language is kind of learning another way of thinking.
Yes.
And it's not only another way of thinking, it's actually another way of being.
Yes.
Because, we don't actually... The person, for example, just to use a European example, the person who speaks and lives in French, for example, is a slightly different type of person than the person who lives and speaks in English.
Yes.
And that's it's not just the culture of France, it's actually embodied in the language, the way they use the language.
Yes.
So if you're learning a language like Sanskrit, even to maybe not to a small extent, you appreciate more of the kind of cultural world or headspace or religious world, for that matter.
Yeah.
And it's always been highly regarded in that kind of respect. I mean, the language is virtually, even like Tibetans virtually, they virtually venerate the language.
Yes.
You'd be well familiar that you can just recite the Sanskrit alphabet as a method of purification. A lot of sadhanas start with all you're doing is reciting the Sanskrit alphabet.
Right.
And a lot of sadhanas will even end with that. You end the sadhana, think, I might have made some mistakes. How can I make up for those mistakes? I know. Well, you probably don't know, but what you're doing is reciting the Sanskrit alphabet to make up for the errors you made.
Yeah.
When you did it.
Why do they think that?
Well, I think it goes back to the idea of the Sanskrit grammarians and ancient Indian traditions, all mantra. All the sounds of the Sanskrit alphabet are regarded as mantra.
Right.
And
that meaning sacred?
Yeah, it's like a sacred sound, but it also has the idea of power. Okay. It conveys some kind of power.
Sure.
So in the Hindu belief system, they actually believe, and this actually carries through in some ways into Buddhist Tantra, but they believe that the universe was created out of the Sanskrit sounds. See, the thing about Sanskrit tradition is that the issue is the sound of the language and not the written form of the language.
Sure.
So the sounds of the language, and the sounds were actually called mantra. And this is part of the reason why you never translate a mantra. Like Om Mani Padme Hum, Sanskrit, not Tibetan.
Right.
And you can't translate it into Tibetan.
I see.
Why? Because the actual sound is understood to have some power to it.
I see.
Yeah, some essential power. So, I mean, it's a little bit of an issue in Buddhism, say between Buddhism and Hinduism. Like in Hinduism, you can't the Hindu scriptures must be in Sanskrit. I mean, you can translate them to read them, but a lot of their power, shall we say, is understood to be in the actual sound of the word. So it's highly essential that you pronounce it properly, which is why Sanskrit grammar started actually, was in order to preserve the tradition of the proper recitation of the Vedas, sacred knowledge. Now, when the Buddha came along, Sanskrit, of course, was in existence, but he was separating himself from the priestly learned tradition, and so he taught in the language that ordinary people, and learned people, everybody could understand. And in the time when he was speaking, that was actually not that different to Sanskrit, but a kind of simpler form of the language. And there was a recognition of the conventional role of language. So there was a much stronger understanding of convention and the way language is used in a conventional kind of sense. And that's an important part of Buddhism. But particularly somewhat in the Mahayana tradition, where they have what are called dharani, which are like long mantras. And then in Tantric Buddhism, this more mantric side of the language comes back to the fore. So the recitation of the language as a purification would normally be in a more tantric kind of context.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Peter, for your time and for sharing your breadth of knowledge about Sanskrit with us. And I'm sure it will be of benefit to many people practicing Dharma and those interested in learning Sanskrit and Buddhism now and in the future. So thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
I've been dreaming and it's all taking shape in my mind. Blue water and sunshine. I was hoping that a real good time would be just ahead for you and me. I've been dreaming and it's all taking shape in my mind. Drumming with your fingers, tabletop rhythms. You said I could write. What would I say to brighten up the light in your eyes? Who designed this anyhow? I've been dreaming and it's all taking shape in my mind. Got to get your eye. I was hoping that a real good time would be just ahead for you. 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 Ba ba ba.